This is Chapter 14, Section 3, and it's on land management and conservation. The objectives are to explain the benefits of preserving farmland, to describe the two ways that rangeland can be managed sustainably, to describe the environmental effects of deforestation, and to explain the function of parks and wilderness areas. Code word baby. All right, land management. So we talked about the different categories of land, and one of the major categories is rural land. And we're talking about rural land. We're basically talking about land that doesn't have a lot of people on it. So that's kind of like farmland where we grow our crops. The different types of rural land. You have farmland where you grow your crops, rangeland where the vaqueros hang out, and they have their cows and their cattle and stuff. Then forest land, where's all the trees. Then we have national and state parks. So usually these are kind of maybe prettier areas, maybe in the mountains or something, or some really unique and beautiful outdoor area that we want to protect and allow other people to come and visit. And then there's wilderness. Wilderness is kind of like, it's just out there. It's just raw. Like we didn't make it a park. It's just sort of, it's just out there. It's untouched by humans, if you will. Sometime in our history, we've managed these lands sustainably. Meaning that how we're using this land, how we're growing our food, or how we're allowing how we're raising our cattle and allowing them to eat off the land is done in a way that can be done for many generations. It's not as if we're using up the soil or eating up all the plants. However, especially nowadays, it's not being done so sustainably. And there's consequences to that. If we're not maintaining our farmland and our rangeland, that's going to affect the food that we're producing, and especially with how large the human population is and how quickly it's continuing to increase in number. We need to keep getting more and more food from our land. And those we talked about ecological services. That's things like the food that land provides. We talked about how land filters out, it filters out pollutants. It helps clean our air, that kind of stuff. Farmland. So as I said, farmland is the land that we use to grow our crops. We have more than 100 million hectares, which is, again, one hectare is like one football field. And urban development, so urban is like city, so city development, so think of Houston, how Houston keeps constantly expanding outward. Like it started off here, and then it expands here and expands here and expands here, and all these expansions are just taking up more and more farmland. And that's a problem because that's less and less land that we have to grow our food. As a result of this, the U.S. government established in 1996 the Farmland Protection Program. And that's just to help state, county, and local governments protect their farmland. And really without it, like that land would essentially just be, it would be in danger of being paved over. It's essentially just trying to make sure that we're not removing too much farmland, that we're making sure that we're not expanding cities and paving land over with concrete too quickly. And this program was renewed in 2008. Code word baller. All right. So land that supports different vegetation types like grasslands, shrublands, and deserts. And basically land that we're not using for farming, so growing our crops, or for timber production, so cutting down trees to make paper, or make a table or something. That's going to be called rangeland. So rangeland is typically going to be arid, so like like right around southwest United States, where it's kind of it's relatively wet. Typically This is the rangeland, so it doesn't have a whole lot of really large trees. It kind of has these smaller plants, and this is your your typical vaquero, just hanging out with his horse right here. Um, and so this is all you have all these plants for cows, this horse here to eat on. And the problem that can happen is this horse or cows or whatever it's out here in the field is they can eat this grass here faster than this grass can grow. And then you have the farmland. And so this is just, a typical farm growing some crops. So some common livestock are going to be cattle, sheep, and goats. And the reason why we value these is because, we like the meat, we like our steak, we like our milk with our cereal, we like wool for our clothes and hides for our leather. And then you also just have native wildlife. So native wildlife is just basically anything that's just kind of out in the wild. It's as the name suggests. It's just any sort of animal that we're not using as humans for either for food or to make some sort of product. And like farmland, rangeland is essential for the world's food supply, and that's because we're growing our meat, like the cattle that we eat, for our steaks and our hamburgers and stuff like that. And so if we don't sustain our rangelands, we're not going to be able to feed the world population growth. From 1977 all the way up to 2030, we needed, or still need about a 40% increase in the food production of rangeland. So that's a lot of extra food that you have to get out of the land. And when you combine that with the fact that we're using up that land to build cities, you can kind of see, I guess, how this could turn into an issue. So the major problem on the range is going to be overgrazing. So I showed you that picture of a rangeland where you had the horse eating the grass. And what can happen is if you deplete the vegetation, if the cattle or whatever eats the grass quicker than it can grow back, then you're going to have overgrazing. And what can happen with overgrazing is if you remove the native plant species, the plant species that normally grow there, you can have less desirable plants that come in and invade the area. So these could be things like weeds. So imagine like you had a nice lawn, and then maybe you stopped watering your lawn, and so some of your grass died off, and then what comes in? A less desirable plant like a weed comes in and it kind of takes over your lawn. And then what can happen that's even more serious is that once all of the vegetation is gone, once that's covered in the land is gone and eaten, then there's nothing to hold the soil in place. Because something that's I think some people might forget about when you think about plants is that plants help keep the soil together. Imagine like trying to walk on just or trying to run on dirt versus trying to run on grass. You can get a lot better traction, or it's a lot easier to get traction on grass than on just plain dirt. And that's because whenever you have plants in there, the plants have their roots that go all throughout the soil, and it kind of helps keep that soil together. The roots are sticking all in and out, and kind of creating this mesh so that the soil that's in between here, is basically trapped by these roots. In my beautiful drawing here. Okay. Code word shut up, as in shut up, I don't care. However, this is a really cool dust storm. Well, cool for us to view, not so cool if you lived here. So this is what can happen if you have soil erosion. And again, soil erosion can be caused by the loss of plants. Whenever you don't have the roots of those plants holding that soil in place, you can get the creation of these dust storms. Because, there's nothing holding all this dust that's flying up in the air. Normally that dust would be, trapped by the roots of the plant. But because, if those plants are gone, then that dust can just fly up in the air and just go crazy. Okay, so how do we maintain the range? Um, as I've kind of mentioned with before, we make this land controlled by the government. So the government essentially will try to control, how much of this rangeland we're giving to ranchers, how much of this rangeland is being turned into cities. Just basically making sure that we have enough of the rangeland, and then it's being given to qualified ranchers who are going to take care of it. And then there was the Public Rangelands Improvement Act of 1978, and this was to help improve land management practices. It's basically trying to train ranchers to better protect and maintain their ranges. Um, and to maintain the range and keep it productive, it's kind of simple. You basically just don't let your cows or cattle eat as much. It's kind of the basic idea. You don't want to overgraze. So you do that by having fewer herds. Um, you could also, because think about it, the cattle or the sheep or whatever it is you're allowing to feed off the plants of the range, they're going wherever the water's at. So if you can have multiple places or multiple watering holes where the cattle is going to go to get their water, then that kind of spreads out where the cattle are going to get their water. Whereas if you just had one place where all the water's at, then all of the plants around that water hole are going to be, completely eaten up because the cattle don't want to go too far away from the water. However, if you got multiple holes all throughout the ranch, then you're kind of spreading the love, so to speak. And then another thing is just to simply just let the rangeland rest. So maybe you have a certain area of the ranch that's being overused or being overeaten, so you just kind of set aside that rangeland for a period of time so that the vegetation, the plants can regrow. So forest lands. Forest lands are your forests. They're your trees. I mentioned furniture and lumber, but we also value trees for things like maple syrup and for something called turpentine. And a major ecosystem service is that trees remove that greenhouse gas, that carbon dioxide from the air, so that we don't further increase the global warming or the climate change that's already happening from all of the greenhouse gases that are going into the air. So harvesting trees, kind of giving you an idea of just how much wood we use, because we use a lot of wood each day. The worldwide average is 1,800 centimeters cubed of wood used per person each day, with each person in the United States using about 3.5 times that amount, which is crazy to think about just how much wood we use. In addition, you have 1.5 billion people in developing countries that use wood, firewood, as a source of fuel. So basically, we need trees and we use a lot of wood. That's kind of the basic idea. Some terminologies. You can classify forest lands into three different categories. You have your virgin forests, which are forests that have never been cut down before. The trees have just remained there in their native habitat. And then you have native forests, which are forests that were planted and managed. So basically, it's kind of like forests that there wasn't a forest there, but we went ahead and just planted this forest that didn't exist before, and then it's basically just using it to to grow trees so that you can cut them down for making paper and furniture and stuff like that. Then you have tree farms where you plant trees in rows, almost like as if it were like a crop. You plant it just like a corn crop or something, where in these nice, neat rows, and then you go through and you cut down these trees once they've reached a certain level of growth. The two most widely methods of harvesting trees are going to be clear cutting and selective cutting. And I'll just kind of jump to this picture. That previous slide is basically just me, whatever I'm saying here. This is clear cutting, where it's just as the word sounds. You just clear cut everything. You just cut all these trees down. Selective cutting is where you just choose the trees that were large enough and ready to be cut down, and you leave the little, the smaller trees that aren't quite ready to be cut down yet. Deforestation, that's going to be the process of clearing forests. It's basically, it's typically used referring to just clear cutting, where you just, you cut down all of the trees. Um, a lot of countries can become severely deforested as populations expand and the demand for forest products increases. You're cutting down forests to make them into roads, factories, um, and why it's a bad thing is kind of obvious as we mentioned, but um, one of them is you have less habitat area for your wildlife. And again, if you cut down your forest or you remove any plants, whether it's a forest or just your normal shrubs or something, you're gonna get soil erosion, and that soil erosion is gonna it's not gonna the plant the especially the tree roots, those big tree roots help to hold the soil in place. And so another thing that can happen in addition to those that dust storm I showed is that you can have soil just washed away, to where you just essentially have no soil for any plants to grow because it all got washed away. Deforestation can happen especially quickly in tropical rainforests where your soil is already pretty thin. And farmers who clear forests in these areas are always going to move on from one plot of land to another. So basically, they chop down all the trees in the rainforest, use that soil until it's no longer productive, and then they move to another area of the rainforest and just cut down all those trees. Um, and basically, they're cutting down trees and forests much quicker than those forests can regrow. Code word boring. What's not boring though is reforestation. So reforestation is the opposite of deforestation. That's where you're taking little baby seeds and you're just planting them into the earth and allowing the trees to regrow. And the reason you want to do that is to kind of reduce or reverse the soil erosion and landslides that are coming that result from having deforestation. And because deforestation is such a large problem, some governments require um, uh, timber and lumber companies to replant lands with trees. Um, if you're going to cut down, 10 trees, then you have to plant 10 trees, like making sure that you're replacing whatever trees you cut down. However, more than 90% of all timber or all trees that are cut down are coming forests that are not maintained by an agency that makes sure those forest ecosystems are healthy. Um, so, because of this, there's a lot of work going on by governments to try and make sure that they have policies and programs in place to maintain these forests. One such thing, you can also have private organizations that will have tree planting programs on the side of highways and roadsides and then in cities to try to, you know, get more trees back onto the land rather than, sitting around waiting for the government to, create some program. Another thing that, obviously helps is setting aside parks and preserves. Uh, the idea of these of parks came in the right around the 1870s when you had um, these explorers that were just exploring all this new land that was given to the United States, and these beautiful areas of land in Wyoming, Montana, and because the U.S. was over in the Northeast and expanding westward, we really wanted to protect these really pretty areas in Wyoming and Montana and make sure they didn't get destroyed and contaminated by humans. Um, and so that led to the national park system, where today we have about 50 national parks. In Yellowstone National Park, this picture right here is one of them, and obviously this is a crazy beautiful area. This is it's crazy looking. It's really cool. So, we want to make sure that we protect these areas, and so that our children and our children's children and their children's children can come here and see all this natural beauty. And this is a map of some of the more famous national parks in the U.S. Here in Texas, we got the Big Bend National Park, um, which I've been to. I would recommend. It's pretty cool. And a lot of public land is not going to be as protected as the national parks are, and that's because the public land isn't as the national parks are set up because they're like really amazing areas. Amazing areas like Yellowstone National Park here, really really crazy beautiful. Whereas public lands, are like your rangeland and your farmland, where it's still important land, but it's not nearly as unique, so they don't get quite as much attention. So as a result, we'll use these public lands. They can be leased out by private companies where they can do logging for products, do mining and ranching. Um, Whereas others can be maintained for hunting, fishing, for wildlife refuges, or if there's an endangered species, you can kind of set aside a special area where you can put that endangered species to allow them to have kind of a natural environment to grow up in. Um, so another different program you can have is what's called a biosphere program. And this is a biosphere program. So the idea is you have human settlement and a preserve that exists all in one area. So in the core area here, this is where you kind of have the preserve, where it's trying to make it this completely natural area that's sort of untouched by humans, and then you try and have these buffer areas, these buffer zones, where the first buffer zone is just going to be a research station. Like you have humans that are, they live or work in this research station, and they do research out in this area and in the core area. And then you'll have another buffer zone where you might have a tourism place where you can take people on some tours. And then you have, some human settlement, but not as much. And then on the very outside, you can start, as you get further and further out from the core area, you have more and more human settlement. Then we have wilderness, and as I mentioned, wilderness is like, it's defined as a region that's not cultivated and not inhabited by humans. And the U.S. Wilderness Act was passed in 1964, and it selected and designated certain areas as wilderness areas. And we have 474 wilderness regions, and it covers about 32 million acres. And these areas are open for things like hiking, for fishing, and camping. However, building roads, paving anything is not allowed, and you can't use any sort of motorized vehicle. They leave that for the parks. The wilderness, they want to keep it, again, they want to make it not cultivated and not inhabited by humans. They want to try to have zero human impact on the area. Basically, it's like you don't want to, if you went into a wilderness area, you wouldn't want to see any signs that a human had been there. Okay, so why do we care about these protected areas? And the obvious thing is that we enjoy these areas. Yeah, like wilderness areas and trees are important to remove greenhouse gases and stuff, but they're also really cool outdoor classrooms. Like you kind of go out and you can learn about nature. There are areas where we can do a lot of research and learn about the different kinds of plants and animals that exist outside. We also want to go out and do hiking and camping. However, the threats to these protected areas, such as more people visiting them, litter, traffic jams, things like that are can begin to plague these natural parks. And then, you have kind of the outside world that keeps growing closer and closer to these parks. You have things like oil and gas, where, some of these parks are on really good oil and gas reserves, where a lot of money could be made if we drilled into these lands and got the oil and gas out of there. But, we want to set aside these areas because they're, we want to protect and preserve them, but, we also want to have cheap gas. We don't want to be dependent on foreign oil. So, you kind of get something of a debate, I guess, that goes on with trying to balance protecting the environment with, also using the resources we have. And these preserved areas are beginning to be affected by climate change, in your air and water pollution that starts to slowly creep into them. Okay, that'll do it for this video.